Oh, these little animations didn't work. Well, anyway, you can take at the beginning of here, and instead of putting corn in at the beginning, uh-oh, I don't know what just happened there. Well, let me go back to the slide here. Sorry, I don't know what happened there.
Kevin, if you clicked on the sync button, is this the slide you want to be at?
Yes, I'm moving back to where I want to be now. Here we go.
Okay.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is the maize kind of supply chain. You could take, in theory, chestnuts, for example, put them in at the beginning of this supply chain, and out the other end, get the same products. Chestnuts are basically 90% starch, just like corn. It's the same thing to the industrial supply chain. So the same thing. Oh, now we got the animations. Look at that. I guess we just needed a little error to fix the other error. Yeah, so you can put chestnuts in instead. On the soybean side, we put it through this whole process, and out the end we get protein meal, oil, biodiesel, kind of the big three. But again, you could take instead and put hazelnuts in that same processing plant, and out the other end you can get the same products, but you originally had a different product, because soybean and hazelnut are basically both half protein, half oil. So thinking about these crops from that perspective, not everyone necessarily agrees with me. Sometimes I get a little extreme and I say that even if people kept eating Doritos for breakfast, that's fine as long as those Doritos were made out of corn flour or out of chestnut flour and high fructose chestnut syrup. If we can at least get that done and get agriculture transformed, solve climate change, all those little things as well, then maybe we can work on the food system and getting people to eat healthier. Now, that's a little extreme. Probably it's all tied together, really connected. But the point is we don't necessarily need to change everything all at once. We can utilize this same infrastructure, but just provide a different raw ingredient from the agriculture side. Okay, so that's on the kind of tree crop side. Now thinking about diversity. How do we implement diversity in alley cropping in a scalable manner? Well, we have to have some practical designs. In the tropics, this is how they implement diversity in agroforestry. Here's an agroforestry system that I saw firsthand in Tanzania. Amazingly productive, all kinds of stuff happening. Banana, mango, cacao, maize, cassava, coffee, all kinds of stuff happening. But certainly not machine harvested. We cannot, I just want to make sure, Sam said, is anyone still seeing slide 18? Hopefully my slides are advancing. If anyone else has that issue where
things are okay now, yeah, Kevin. There was a bit of a problem back there, but we're in good shape.
Okay, sorry. So this is great, maybe really productive, a lot of ecology happening here when you mix everything together, but the fact of the matter is, this is where we're starting from here in the temperate zone. This is how we're currently farming. To go from this nice, straight, GPS-oriented lines all the way to this would be quite a long shot. So how can we add diversity and add some complexity without totally ruining everything and making it unmanageable and overwhelming? So here's the standard alley cropping system, one tree species, crop in between. How do we add diversity to this? Well, we can alternate tree species within the row. We still have our nice linear rows of trees. We have plenty of room for the crop in between. The other way is we could alternate rows instead of within the row. Now you have one species in one row, one in the other. This may seem trivial. It's kind of simplistic, but it's not totally something that we can ignore, because just from these two simple examples, option B here in the upper right is probably a system that is going to have more niche complementarity. If those two tree species are different enough, you're going to put them closer together. You're really going to get that kind of complementarity, maybe increase yields that way, really maximize your use of that space. But at the same time, if you have a mechanical harvester that needs to go down a row a single row and hit all the trees of one species, then option C is going to be much more economically efficient, even if B might improve the ecology a little bit. So there are a lot of things to consider when thinking about adding diversity. There's definitely economic and social constraints on that as well, not just diversity is good kind of thing. And of course, you can also start going into multiple layers as well, adding shrubs and vines and expanding vertically rather than just diversifying the existing tree layer you have there. So I'm going to show you kind of one kind of example of that in a second here. So that was kind of spatial. How do you deal with diversity kind of in a spatial sense? Here's kind of the same question in terms of in a temporal sense. So another important thing to consider is complementary tree crop combinations that provide both the early returns, so that's not nut trees. Nut trees do not provide early returns, and long-term yields, as nut trees do that. They're going to be around for a long time. So how do we kind of straddle both of those things to make sure we don't go broke early on, but that we have a system that is sustaining in the long term? So here's just an example. This is from one of the research sites we have at U of I of an example system with multiple tree species. But I just kind of want to show you how it evolves over time. So this is, again, just caloric yield on the y-axis, and then years after you start planting the trees on the x-axis. So from 1 to 20 years after you plant the initial trees. So early on at our system, we just cut hay in the alleys. So right off the bat, you're maximizing your hay yield. The trees are tiny, not influencing that at all. So you're doing fine on hay yield. And then you go a couple years in, all of a sudden your quick producing shrubs like currants or raspberries or something like that are going to kick in. That's the green there. Those are going to ramp up pretty fast, and you're going to hit peak yields for all those little shrub crops right away. And your nut trees have barely even started producing at all. Then the hazelnuts kick in, they're a little bit faster, and then finally, maybe 15 years down the road, your chestnuts are finally going to hit peak production. And so early on, we have the money that's coming from cattle or hay and our shrub crop, and then over time, that's switching over to the hazelnuts, chestnuts, kind of big long-term canopy trees. And as those nut trees grow, that's certainly going to reduce the yield of the stuff underneath it. But overall, those things were still really helpful early on. So we have to think about diversity not only in terms of spatial structure, but also in terms of temporal structure and kind of succession. So along this same vein, I'm going to talk to you about just a couple projects that we have going, some future work, things that aren't going, but I'd like to suggest that someone start doing, but all kind of related to this: how do we improve and make practical these kind of multi-species systems and tree crops in agroforestry. So here's a commercial example. This is from my farm in central Illinois of just trying to add diversity in and do it in a way that is profitable and in a way that I don't need to be out there all the time because I don't have that time. So we have, it's a little weird there, but we have Chinese chestnut as the main tree species. So we have rows and rows of chestnut, kind of commercial spacing, nothing's changed, a standard chestnut orchard there. But then we also have, within the row of those chestnuts, we have red currants, which are typically hand harvested. They don't work super well with the machine harvester. So we put them in the rows with the chestnuts because you can't really get a machine harvester in there very easily anyway because the trees are in the way. So we're not causing inefficiency with the harvester. The currants are going to provide income basically from year 3, 4, and the chestnuts aren't going to do that for another 10 years. So we're using that space to make money early on rather than just sinking money into it to help those chestnuts grow. In between, in the alleys, rather than just mowing it again and spending money, we have rows of black currants. The black currants are machine harvested. The spacing is such that the machine will fit down there just perfectly. And for both black and red currants, the reason why we're growing currants is that as those chestnut trees grow and have big canopies and cast shade on everything below it, Currants are very shade tolerant. They're native to the woodlands and the understories of the woodlands, so they're very shade tolerant compared to other shrub crops. And so even as the chestnut trees mature, we should be able to get commercial yields off of these crops underneath. We're also going to start experimenting with kind of an alley crop in the alley crop. What you see kind of the green ground cover there. Most people just use grass or clover in those alleys and just mow it, kind of just have it there to keep the ground there. But we're going to be exploring with, again, more ways we can kind of add things in to make money and not sacrifice efficiency. So we're going to put asparagus in there, we're going to put some pollinator habitat, maybe rhubarb, see what will actually work with the harvester but also make money. That was just one commercial example. The Savannah Institute works with a whole bunch of farms all over the Midwest that are experimenting with all different kinds of examples of this, where they're trying to make money, combine different crops. So check out the Sven Institute and the case study program just to get engaged with that network and see what else is going on on different farms. Another place that you can do that is one of Sven Institute's new projects, perennialmap.org. A lot more points on this map. This is a really new project out of SI, but I definitely encourage you to go check it out. We're constantly improving the website and updating it. We got a version kind of 2.0 coming out this winter sometime. But this is basically meant to be a place where everyone growing perennial crops of any sort can get themselves on the map, find each other, find resources, find markets, find suppliers, and just have a community for perennial agriculture. Text is a little weird there, but we have a new research site at the University of Illinois exploring a lot of this stuff explicitly. I won't talk a lot about this, but it's a really cool research site, 30 acres, a lot of different treatments going on, different levels of diversity. If you're interested in that, definitely get in touch with the team there. Just put in the ground a couple years ago, so it'll be a little bit of time before it looks like these diagrams, but ultimately it'll provide some really great insights on diversity in alley cropping. Here's a map of it as well. Basically every plot is some level of diversity, mixture of alley cropping, of species in alley cropping. Each plot is 1 acre, and we have 7 different treatments kind of throughout. So that approach is great, but it kind of is still following the kind of classic ANOVA approach that's so common in agricultural experiments, where you have just kind of your couple favorite treatments and you just compare them one-off. But really, at the end of the day, diversity is a continuous variable. It's something that we need to explore in designs that leverage that kind of continuous nature. And this is something that is not really being done at all in tree crops or woody crops or agroforestry. And so if anyone is interested in this or wants to collaborate on this, this is something that I'm really getting excited about and something that I see myself focusing on next. So what you see here, probably mesmerized by some of these designs here, but these are systematic experimental designs that vary diversity or density on a continuous scale. And these experiments can be extremely powerful in the future to help us kind of identify what levels of diversity, what densities, what combinations actually are the most productive or the most efficient in these systems. And so this is really what I see as the next frontier of field studies for agroforestry systems. Another thing that we're working on at U of I is actually taking currants as an understory crop that we've been working with and seeing, can we actually take this crop and breed it to be even better as an understory crop? Not just breeding it to be higher yielding in general, which is what's been happening over the last couple hundred years, but specifically breeding it for use in agroforestry systems. So you can see a kind of a giant pedigree here. This is a pedigree of every blackcurrant variety that we know about, and the colors are which country they originated in. We have Russia, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, all over the place. Currants have been bred for a long time, and we're trying to figure out where in this long history of current breeding, can we find some extremely shade-tolerant varieties and pull it out and start a breeding program specifically for agroforestry. We have one experiment in the ground where we have shade structures. You can see in the picture there over black currants, shading at different levels. We have one cultivar under there, and this is kind of the first thing to see what shade level is really kind of ideal for currants, or at what shade level does production really start to fall. And so far, you can see the shade level on the x-axis and the yield on the y-axis relative to no shading. And basically we have no significant differences from the no shade control all the way through 50% shade. And only when we get to 70% shade, which is quite substantial, that shade cloth is pretty dense, do we finally start to see a reduction in yield there. So you know, in an alley cropping context, then you can just think when you're designing systems to, as long as you can keep the understory no more than 50% shaded where you're planting the currants, you're not going to see any decreases in yield, based on this study at least. And then we're going to kind of expand that to just go with 40 different cultivars under shade, and again try to identify where we can start with for a breeding program. I'm going to actually skip over this here and go to a couple slides in. See if I remember how to do this. I'm going to talk briefly about HiSafe here before I get off. So HiSafe, I added as many adjectives to this slide as I could think of that describe the model. A 3D, spatially explicit, mechanistic, biophysical model for agroforestry. So if that doesn't scare you away from models, then contact me, because we should work together. So HiSafe is a model, a computer model for agroforestry systems that has been developed here in Montpellier, France, by Christian Duprat and his team over the last almost 20 years. And it's really the state of the art from my perspective. This is the best kind of one slide that I can show you to kind of introduce you to the model. But on the right, you can see that, first of all, the model is in 3 dimensions. The model really does grow 3D trees, 3D crops. The roots explore the whole 3D soil. And it's not just kind of a model in terms of math and code. It really has kind of this 3D structure. So there's a tree or trees, there's crops on the ground, and then for every little voxel of soil underneath the ground there, you know exactly how many roots are in there, how much water's in there, nutrients, etc. And so basically in 3 dimensions, above and below ground, the trees are competing for light. The trees and crops, I should say, are competing for light, they're competing for water, and they're competing for nitrogen. So those are the 3 kind of primary interactions that take place in an agroforestry system, and all that competition is happening within the model. And so the model is really useful to kind of explore a lot of these things. You can also do a lot of the common management interventions that are typical in agroforestry systems. You can prune the trees, you can thin trees, you can root prune. So all of these things that are typical in agroforestry systems, of course, fertilize, irrigate, all of those things. So you can explore management strategies as well. And I know it's kind of hard to talk about the whole abstract, what a model is, but the model was built to answer this question. Should we mix trees and crops, specifically in alley cropping? I really like the cartoons there at the bottom, but so with the model you can simulate a forestry stand, monoculture forestry stand like you see on the left. You can simulate monoculture crops like you see on the right, and then you can simulate an actual alley cropping system which has them mixed. And so you can really start to answer questions about should we or should we not mix those two, or what interactions happen when you do mix those two. very few people are actually going to get really excited about that and say, oh, I'm going to go do some modeling. But here's what I just want to describe to you as far as what the uses for the model are, why you might want to collaborate with someone else who does work with the model. So, for example, in this top one here, why would you use the model? So look at the third bullet there, access intermediary variables that are difficult to measure experimentally. So if you want to explore water in your agroforestry experiment, you can put some sap flow sensors on the trees. You can get a pretty good idea of how much water the trees are using. You can measure soil moisture. You can kind of do a water balance. But what's difficult to measure, extremely difficult to measure experimentally, is where in the soil profile the trees are getting their water from. Are they getting it from 2 meters down, half a meter down? That's really hard to measure. You have to use all kinds of crazy isotope techniques that are really expensive. Whereas the model, you can use it to at least get an estimate of where the roots are and where the trees are getting their water from. And that can provide to you some insights for how to organize your experiments or your analyses. Another thing is you have an experiment. It's really a great experiment, but you're only in one place at one time. So if you want to see how that experiment might play out in a different location, in a different time with a past climate, or maybe in future climate change, you can use the model to do that. Management and decision making. If you want to rerun your experiment with the model, but say, oh man, I wish I had pruned the trees every year, or I wish I had done root pruning, how would that have affected my results? And finally, I think the most important is testing systems that haven't been tested yet in the field. Many of us might be at the point where we want to design new agroforestry experiments, but we don't know, out of the many different forms that agroforestry can take, what might be the best one to study. If I want to integrate diversity into my alley cropping experiments, how much diversity? Where do I put it? Which species? These are the questions that we can pose to the model first, explore 1,000 different combinations, 1,000 different designs, and just give us some direction on what we want to actually put the investment in money and time in the field. Out of the 1,000 experiments, maybe we pick the top 5 that seem to me the most promising. That seems to me to be a lot more rational than kind of assuming what you think might be the best systems or crops to combine, for example. So the model can be used as a tool in that manner as well. So if anyone is interested in modeling in agroforestry or working with HiSafe or anything like that, definitely get in touch with me. I'm happy to collaborate and talk about it. This is what I'm doing here in France, and hopefully by the end of my time here, HiSafe will be publicly available and ready for everyone to dive in and do some really cool stuff. So with that, I'll just say, kind of put up these little conclusions here. We didn't go over the field experiments, but you can kind of see the conclusion. There's my email address if you want to get in touch with me about anything I talked about. I'm more than happy to talk about it, especially if you are interested in collaborating on something, kind of moving forward some of the kind of frontiers that I talked about. Definitely get in touch, and thanks for listening, and I'll hang around now to answer some questions.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Thank you for that presentation. We're going to open it up for some questions and comments now. We do have some time. So to the listening audience, I'm going to open up a question dialog box here. And you should find at the bottom of that box a dialog where you can type in your questions at the bottom of this Q&A box. But until some of those questions come in, perhaps we can take some questions with some of the people who are joining me here in the room here at the University of Missouri at the Center for Agroforestry. So please, the first question will come from Mike Gold, the Director of the Center for Agroforestry.
Well, I want to know if financial information can be overlaid into the model.
Can financial information be overlaid into the model, Kevin?
Good question, because money matters more than anything else, right? So the model will give you out for every year crop yield, tree yield, and so as long as you have your price for each of those things, then you can pull out revenue on that side. You can adjust in the model all those different management items, and from that, if you have estimates of labor hours for those different things, you can certainly do that. I mean, all those management type things, how much you fertilize, how much you irrigate, how much you prune, those are all inputs. So you're going to tell the model, this is how I'm going to manage it. So if you know those things ahead of time, you may have estimates of those costs as well. But the model itself is purely biophysical. But if you have prices of things, then you can certainly easily multiply outputs by all that and get a budget at the end.
Thank you. We do have time for more questions, so if some of the folks still with us listening want to send in some questions. I had one question, Kevin. I noticed when you were talking about the currents, there was, I think, several cultivars tested at 4 shade levels, and then 40 cultivars tested at a single shade level. Is that because it kind of arrived at, was it a space limitation, or was it that you, through previous experimentation, arrived at what was the sort of the optimal shade levels, and they really wanted to test all the cultivars at that optimal shade level? I guess what I'm asking is, why the 40 cultivars would not be tested at multiple shade levels?
Yeah, it just becomes a matter of space and money. The shade cloths and all the infrastructure are not cheap, and also with the wind we get, they turn into sails and fly away all the time. So we want to just pick one shade level, and really the variability doesn't matter as much between shading for that experiment. The point of that 40 cultivars, one shade level experiment is just to assess, is there any variation in shade tolerance among all these varieties? For those of you who are breeders, you know that if there's no variation in that trait, you can't do breeding. So we don't know if there's any variation even to begin with. It may have all been bred out by this point. We don't know. Those 40 cultivars we selected from that pedigree basically to kind of be from all over the place. We made sure that we had cultivars from every different country that has worked on black currants in the last 100 years, just to try to get as much diversity in there, genetic diversity, as possible. So we just want to use that experiment to provide just an insight of, is there any variability, maybe the top 5 that we might want to put into a breeding program, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as you can see, there's a number of questions coming in now. Perhaps I'll start you off, Kevin, with one from Sam Palmer, who asks, he's curious in asking if you think the model will be able to help understand the impacts of different spatial arrangements in silvopastoral systems.
Yes, absolutely. So you can include as many different trees and species as you want in the model, any spatial arrangement that you want. You just give each tree an X and a Y coordinate. So you can certainly do that. The model does not include livestock explicitly, but you can certainly pretend that they're there by basically telling the model when, basically growing forage as the alley crop, and then telling the model when you want to cut it, and then maybe after every time you cut it, you add a little bit of fertilizer to simulate the livestock moving through. So you can easily simulate the impact of livestock, and then certainly run that for different spatial arrangements and see which arrangement might have the most yield for your forage.
Thanks. Kevin, is there any question that you, of the remaining questions that you'd want to select first to address?
Yes, let me look here. Last one about randomly spaced trees. Yeah, so you don't have to have the trees in lines in the model. They can be kind of random anywhere you want as well.
Yeah, that's Sam's follow-up to the question about silvopasture. How about, you see Bruce Stevenson's question there. In addition to congratulating on an excellent presentation, he's asking about if you have any data on the impacts of non-commercial biodiversity, for example, insects and birds. So non-commercial biodiversity in alley cropping farms versus sun monoculture farms, as he's written it. So
Sure.
Any data on the impacts of non-commercial biodiversity?
So we have measured insect biodiversity at the site that I worked at University of Illinois. We measured aerial insects and ground-dwelling insects. We're working on that data right now. Insects are a pain because you have to go through and identify all these little things, and that takes forever. But we're hoping to publish that in the next few months. And then we have at least taken soil cores and run some DNA analyses on soil microbe biodiversity in alley cropping versus monoculture. And still waiting on getting that data back from the DNA people, but so we have that in the pipeline as well. Birds are a little bit harder because your plots need to be large enough to actually be able to really say anything. Our plots at U of I are kind of marginal in that respect. We can certainly walk around and we can visually see where all the birds are hanging out, but it's hard to make kind of sound when you have smaller plots. So yeah, some of that is definitely in the pipeline.
Yeah, and sorry, I should say that Bruce clarified his question that he was talking about impacts on non-commercial biodiversity, not of non-commercial biodiversity, but I think you addressed that. On soil biodiversity, let's perhaps move up to the top there, and Mike Dunn's question asks about the fungal bacterial ratio changes, and he's assuming that there would be changes between the trees and the alleys, and he asks, is there any research or findings on the density and aspect ratio of tree plantings needed to have an effective mycorrhizal network?
That's certainly an interesting question. I didn't do any of that work yet, but and the soil stuff we did only had bacteria, didn't do any fungal. But we do have a hypothesis, at least, that some of these kind of hot spots of higher yield on our research site are from kind of mycorrhizal interactions. So maybe we'll be able to prove that at some point. But one question that I have explored with related to mycorrhiza are I do a lot of tree plantings out in big open ag fields that have been ag for years and years and years and have been sprayed for years and are not near any kind of repository of forest or anything like that to get spores from. And as I'm out there planting these trees, we always inoculate our tree roots with mycorrhiza before we plant them to help early growth on, and also under my assumption that there really is not a lot of spores in the soil there. But I'm really interested in the question about if you don't inoculate, how well will the trees do? If you restore a corn and soybean monoculture field in the middle of nowhere or not near any ecology to an agroforestry system, will the mycorrhizal population kind of find its way there, or do you really have to inoculate in order to get back to where it could be? So hopefully I'll be able to work on that at some point. I see Aaron's question here about caloric values of multiple crops, and some of them now, the more emphasis is given to quality and flavor, especially those that are consumed raw with minimal processing. Yeah, so absolutely. All of these crops that I've talked about, currants, hazelnuts, chestnuts, are all going into specialty markets right now, where they're eaten raw or minimally processed, and that's absolutely true. So the breeding objectives for these tree crops to date have primarily been in that mindset for quality and flavor. Hazelnut breeding has really focused on disease resistance, for example, first and foremost, but then getting the size of the nuts and the crackability and the flavor to where big player companies want it to be. And that's absolutely true. However, if we're going to be growing these crops on a large scale and agroforestry is going to become a big agricultural player, and these crops are being used more from an industrial staple crop perspective, quality and flavor become much less important, and yield than just raw bulk material becomes more important. I don't really do any of my work or really think very much at all about the existing specialty markets that all these crops go into right now. I certainly want to tap into those and make some money off of the farms that I have, and certainly that's what we'll be doing. But from a research perspective, I really try to think about my research questions and experiments from the perspective of, if we had 100,000 acres of this system, do my questions still make sense and are they relevant?
Well, thank you. Well, we've come to the hour. There are a couple of questions remaining. Some are just about the availability of the slides or whether some of this data is in your publications. So we can, if you're amenable, Kevin, we can make a PDF of the presentation available to the participants. We're also recording the presentation, so that will be available, as are all previous webinars. Recorded versions of previous webinars are available on the centerforagroforestry.org website. Just click on the webinar link. Kevin, there's a couple of questions there that we haven't addressed, and one might be of interest is Daniel Potta-Hensel's question about similar research and trial institutions for Mediterranean climates based out of California, if you're aware of any such modeling and agroforestry allocropping work into California.
Not off the top of my head, I can't say that. There has been a lot of research in California on savanna systems, like natural savanna systems, oak savanna systems. They have a lot more of that left compared to what we have left for oak savanna in the Midwest. And so a lot of that research is really applicable in terms of tree understory interactions. But in terms of agroforestry explicitly, I'm not as familiar with much, no.
Right. I might make mention of the Kremen laboratory at the University of California. Claire Kremen and her lab and students have done quite a bit of work on hedgerow agroforestry in the Central Valley, and primarily its benefits for biodiversity and pollinator habitat. And also another researcher, Amélie Gaudin, also from the University of California, who is starting new research on silvopasture in orchards in California and effects on soil health. Those are some we're aware of. I'm sure there's more. But I think with that, Kevin, I think we've touched on most of the questions here. And unless there's any additional questions from our in-person audience, then, well, I'd like to thank you very much for an excellent presentation. And also thank you to everyone who's joined us for this webinar. Do check back on our website, the centerforagroforestry.org, and click on the webinar link for the upcoming webinar schedules. We'll be posting the spring schedule in a couple of weeks. We'll have an updated schedule for spring 2018. In January, in lieu of webinar, we will be broadcasting, live streaming our annual Agroforestry Symposium. That's the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry's annual Agroforestry Symposium. It will be on January 25th, 2018. And the theme is soil health in diverse cropping systems. And that will be live streamed, and you can join us for that. Check out the links on centerforagroforestry.org. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. See you next time.